Medical science has made amazing advances in the last few years. With the help of sophisticated equipment, specialists now cure people who, in the past, would have died at an early age or would not have survived birth at all. Many children in the industrialized world are born so prematurely that they must be rushed to an intensive care unit immediately after birth. For these infants, life begins with a fight against death. Although their chance for survival is much greater than it would have been decades ago, there's a darker side to this success. The lives of the children who survive this early trauma may be plagued by handicaps, suffering, and pain. What should we do? Should we make every effort to save the child? Or should we simply allow the baby to die comfortably? This is the moral dilemma parents and doctors face daily.
Deze tweeling die is 3 dagen geleden geboren.
These twins were born 3 days ago, far too early.
26 weken en een paar dagen.
After a pregnancy of only 26 weeks plus a few days. The first child is doing very well at the moment. His twin brother is having a lot of trouble breathing, and his lungs aren't fully developed yet. We'll just have to wait and see how things develop. Over the past 3 days, we've tried all technical possibilities at our disposal to stimulate the development of the lungs.
Immediately after they were born, we had to make a number of decisions, like, well, what are we going to do if things get really bad? And after 2 or 3 days, things went from bad to worse, and you don't quite realize what is going on. And yet you think, yes, the doctors, they think it's all right, so let them do what they think is right.
Will the child live? Will he be handicapped, even severely disabled? And if that happens, will his life be worth living? Too many uncertainties for a clear-cut decision. Yet parents and doctors must make a decision. Are they going to continue aggressive treatment or stop? Can ethics help us think through these moral dilemmas?
I mean, my own experience, having worked for 15 or 20 years closely with people, with physicians engaged in clinical practice, I mean, my own experience leads me very strongly to believe that there's the same sort of subtlety of understanding and interpretation involved in dealing with the moral quandaries that arise out of the details of clinical situations as we confront them, as there is in case law, in common law, as there is in the technical aspects of medicine too, where great complexity of detail has to be taken into account.
De beslissing om dit soort kindjes te behandelen.
The decision of whether to treat these children is not something that needs to be discussed. We always treat them at 26 weeks. Sometimes we do debate whether to treat them at 24 or 25 weeks, but we often do so. There's no discussion if they're 26 weeks old. We always treat them, and we just see whether we can succeed. And quite often it still doesn't work out. And those are the cases we have to discuss.
Different ethical theories suggest different issues that parents and doctors might want to take into account. The 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant developed ideas that have deeply influenced modern medical ethics.
Kant, I think, would focus on that child. Would it have a chance to grow into a moral equal, into a person who can lead his own life, into an autonomous person who can decide for himself what's important in life and what's not, and everything you do will depend on that. So you can apply Kant's famous formula of the categorical imperative. Never use others solely as a means, but also always as an end in themselves. This can be neatly applied to the relationship between parents and children.
Kant's theory recognizes the tremendous importance of human dignity and of treating a human being not as a means of your ends, but as an end in him or herself. And that's an ethical insight that should never be neglected in any case like this. Let's suppose they do count as persons in the Kantian sense. Then the Kantian ethical theory will say we have to treat them as ends in themselves, which means, of course, if they were already adult, it would mean respecting their own will and their own choices, but where they're children, doing everything we can to promote both their development and their happiness.
Kant also framed the categorical imperative from another perspective.
Kant's first and most famous test for the morality of anything you're thinking of doing is that you have to ask yourself, would you will the principle you're going to act on to be a universal law? Could you? Or even if you could, would you want everybody to behave the way you're thinking of behaving?
Kant also asks us to reflect on the extent to which we are making exceptions of ourselves in the way we're dealing with others. That is, am I doing something that I would not want others to do, that I would not be willing to have everyone else do? And I think that's another important question to be asked about any kind of behavior that we're thinking about. Is this the kind of behavior that I would be willing to have everyone do? Is this the sort of thing that everyone could do? Is this the sort of thing everyone has a right to do?
Following Kant's ideas, parents, doctors, and nurses should ask, how would we want anyone in this kind of situation to be treated? How would I want to be treated if I were in the situation of this helpless infant? But Kant set out his philosophy in general terms. How can it be applied to modern medicine? For that matter, what are the odds with babies like this?
Als je denkt dat op dit moment ongeveer, nou zeg maar ruim de helft van de kinderen van 26 weken in leven
When you
gehouden
consider that,
kan
at
worden,
the moment,
en dat van de
over half the
overlevende
children
kinderen
can be
er
kept alive
zo,
at 26
ik denk
weeks,
naar schatting op dit moment,
and that of those who survive,
75%
approximately 85% will turn out completely normal. 6 to 7% will end up with only a light handicap, which is perfectly reconcilable with life and society, and that 6 to 8% will be more severely handicapped. Then I think that views about this type of care and its results will differ.
Dat soort zorg en de resultaten ervan, dat daar verschillende opvattingen over kunnen bestaan.
To respect the dignity of the child does not necessarily mean doing everything possible to keep it alive.
Concentrate on the interests of the child and see whether or not the child has a good chance of surviving within a relatively short period of time, or whether it's likely to die very soon. If it can survive, would that life have any quality? You can also consider the interests of the child, because it's not in the interests of the child if it won't be able to communicate, to look after itself, if it's totally dependent on other people's help. If this sort of thing can be predicted, then you can, I think, seriously doubt whether it's in the interests of the child to go to such lengths to keep a child alive.
Of course, in making decisions like this, there are other people involved than just the infant. The infant is the patient. It's the infant's interests that we're primarily concerned with. But what about the parents? What about implications, larger implications for the medical healthcare system, the society as a whole? What about all that?
Kant felt that nothing mattered except having a good will. Morality is a matter of intention. As long as we act with the right intentions, the consequences of our actions are not important. Another ethical theory makes consequences the primary consideration. The value of any action should be judged by the good or bad it will produce.
Thinking of ethics in terms of the good could take many forms, but it's often associated with consequentialism, which is thinking of the rightness of actions in terms of their consequences. And the best known form of consequentialism is utilitarianism, which thinks that an action is right if it produces the most possible utility. And different theories have different views about what utility should be taken to be.
What Kant will stay away from is questions about the costs or the benefits, the consequential results of these forms of treatment. Yet those are also important questions, and utilitarianism focuses our attention on that aspect of the situation. Utilitarianism will force us to ask questions like, what are the overall social benefits that will come from keeping this infant alive? What are the overall social harms that will derive from keeping this infant alive?
Yesterday, Michael was put on a new respirator. It amounts more or less to the same thing. But as I told you yesterday, to get the pressures with the other machine, we had to administer lots of liters of air per minute. With this new machine, we don't need to do that, which is why he was put on this machine yesterday. Of course, you'd heard about it and come across it in your own social circle of neighbors and friends. But every child is different. It's very hard to say. How will the child respond? How will that child develop? It just varies.
Michael has had 2 minor brain hemorrhages. How will it affect him? What problems might we still run up against?
And they really didn't know at that time.
Utilitarianism in any form requires you to be able to estimate consequences, either of a given action or of a policy. And of course, we don't know the future. We don't know it at all well. And people sometimes say, well, utilitarianism never actually tells you what you should do. It just tells you what you should have done. Because after you see some of the consequences, you say, oh yeah, that would have worked best.
Kantian ethics focus on the dignity of the individual. Utilitarianism tries to take a broader view and deal in numbers.
It's a social ethic whereby you try to make decisions about your behavior on the basis of the interests of all those concerned. If many children are born who will never be able to take care of themselves, who will remain dependent on all sorts of medical treatment, then this will place a serious burden on our healthcare system. And a utilitarian would thus simply take this into account when weighing up the balance. He'd say, well, if we devote all our medical care to such cases, it will be at the expense of the treatment of other things, such as care of the elderly, who will then get less attention, but who would, of course, like to have more care. There would simply be no room or time for that, because all the time is taken up by the children in this example. A utilitarian would thus also take into account the interests of society.
But in human terms, can you tell parents that the money it would cost to treat their baby could be better spent on public health programs?
With the utilitarian theory, where we act as though everything's a matter of trade-offs, where we're just kind of producing the largest total benefits, here again we don't get that sense of the deep tragedy of a case like this.
The parents are the ones who have to deal with and live with the baby. They are the ones whose feelings, whose emotions are most immediately and intimately connected with the outcome. Sure, the parents' interests matter a lot.
Well, the other problem is that the parents only learned yesterday that the scan showed that the baby has had brain hemorrhages on both sides. They thought that the breathing was the biggest problem, actually. So they were very upset when they returned from the consultation. They talked to a doctor again today and discussed it again. They also know that the brain scan was still the same, and that otherwise they'll just have to wait and see how things go. We're glad, though, that things are stable tonight. Well, they're still your children, and I didn't feel at all, at the beginning, that they really were my children. In the hospital, you would ask them, can I perhaps change their diapers? Could I take their temperature? Just to be near my children and touch them and things. But there wasn't a feeling like, they're my children and I can do with them what I want.
Parents have a major role in these decisions. They must give their approval before the medical staff can initiate or withdraw treatment. From the perspective of Kant's philosophy, parents should put aside their own interests and see the child as an end in himself. For utilitarians, parents should pursue the greatest good for the greatest number and take into account the interests of all concerned, the child, themselves, and the wider society. A third view, virtue ethics, asks how a person can achieve happiness or the good life. It puts virtues and character at the center of this quest, and it sets every decision in relation to the character and life of the person making it.
It starts from the idea that our life as a whole has a shape in that all our projects and all our values do fit together, that you can see your life not just as going on day by day, but that you can see each day in your life as the center of a circle, which is made up of all your ongoing commitments and projects and the values that you hold.
The approach of virtue ethics is certainly going to focus on the question, what's the whole life going to look like? What are the possibilities and opportunities that these children would have in the whole of their life? Now, if the quality of the whole life looks like it's bound to be so reduced that it's not going to have in it the shape, overall shape of a human life, well, then we may still have some other obligations to these children, that is to relieve their pain, not to cause them suffering, but we won't consider them as human in Aristotle's sense, because for Aristotle, being human is a functional notion. It's a question of what functions that are characteristic of humanness you can actually attain.
Many of the central ideas of virtue ethics were laid out by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Aristotle argued that moral virtues are habits that allow a person to choose what's right and to find purpose and fulfillment during one's life. In virtue ethics, moral fitness can be compared to physical fitness. You achieve it over a long period of time through training and developing good habits. Because of its long-term view, virtue ethics is sometimes criticized for not offering sufficient guidance to people who are faced with crises.
It's certainly true that a virtue ethics theory won't give you any kind of formula for saying what the right action is. Now, some people think that's a defect of virtue ethics, and I'd be more inclined to think it's a virtue of virtue ethics, because I think any theory which produces some kind of formula for right action, as say utilitarianism does, is unrealistic, because I think on reflection it's clear that there could be no such thing as a formula for right action.
Yet there are some linkages between the virtues and our actions. There's two important linkages. One is virtues, the virtues are exhibited in our activities. Some of our activities are outcomes of our virtues. Courageous behavior is the outcome, the result of the virtue of courage. Compassionate behavior is the outcome of the virtue of compassion. Secondly, our behaviors form our virtues. Behaving compassionately tends to make you a compassionate person. Behaving bravely tends to make you a brave person. So, two questions that can be asked about any action from a virtue perspective are these. What kind of behaviors would the virtues require in this kind of situation? And what impact will these behaviors have on the virtues or the lack of virtue of the people involved? So, for example, we might ask if this child is allowed to die or maybe killed, what impact will that have on the character of the people involved? Will that make the doctors, for example, calloused? Will that make the doctors unfeeling? Will that lead them to lose compassion? And if so, then from a virtue perspective, we would say there's something wrong because of the kind of character that kind of behavior is going to lead to. A different approach that a virtue theorist might take to a particular action is to ask, what would be the courageous thing to do in this kind of situation? What would be the compassionate thing to do in this kind of situation?
Because virtue ethics looks at each decision in the context of a whole life, it calls attention to conflicts among life's values.
I guess the strength of the Aristotelian approach against the others is that it always understands that human life is full of conflict because there's a plurality of goods. You can't have them all the time. And so it's ready to say, look, there are many cases in which goods are simply conflicting and you're not going to be able to do everything you ought to do.
For many years, I used to find Aristotle's ethics really very hard to follow because I was reading Aristotle expecting him to give me a recipe for finding out the difference between right and wrong and for discovering the right thing to do in any situation and the criterion for recognizing what was universally wrong. But that's not the way Aristotle depicts our human life. He says that ethical questions are continually subject to reconsideration, that moral problems are like the problems of a steersman, for instance, who's taking his boat along a hazardous shore and has to decide when to change tack. He has his eye always on 100 things: the state of the water, indication of shoaling of the shore, the changing force of the wind, whether the sun is just setting, and so on. And it's the capacity to see through the complexities of the local conditions to a point at which you can take a reasonable decision. That's what is the mark of the wise steersman. And he says the same thing about doctors, that a wise doctor is one who doesn't think he has a cut and dried recipe for this whole disease. The wise doctor is the one who's monitoring the patient's condition and recognizing when he has to change the treatment in order to do the best possible for the patient. And ethics, he says, is like that. Ethics is in this respect subject to the occasion.
Kantian, utilitarian, and virtue ethics all suggest issues that parents and doctors might take into account in deciding whether to prolong the life of a child. None offers a simple or clear-cut answer, but each suggests issues that most people would agree are important to consider.
The right thing to do is what there are the best reasons for doing, what there are the most compelling, logical arguments for doing. Now, it's a feature of moral life. It's a common feature of moral life that there can be arguments on both sides of an issue. A lot of people don't understand this. A lot of people think that if they're on one side of an issue, that they have to have all the good arguments on their side.
So I think the kind of wisdom we have in ethics is a kind of wisdom which is much better described using words like reasonable than it is words like rational. If we emphasize rationality too much in thinking about ethics and thinking about decision and action, we lead ourselves back into the trap of thinking that we can prove in a general kind of way what is right, what is wrong in all cases, in all circumstances. And that's not the way life goes. The way life goes is that we are continually being confronted with fresh, complex constellations of difficult situations, and we have to steer our way through.
It doesn't bother me particularly if later on my child has to go to a school for the mentally retarded. You can say then it was caused by something. But how many children who were normal at birth, well, have that too. So it really isn't strange or anything. That's how I cope with it.
Medical outcomes may be very difficult to predict, and moral issues may be impossible to resolve into one simple answer. But there does seem to be a process that can give families and doctors some assurance that they are proceeding on a wise course.
An honest discussion of a problem like the problem of whether we go on doing anything for this terribly damaged premature infant. The way in which we do this is indeed to sit down together and see if we can't talk our way through the situation to the point at which we can all, while continuing to feel sad, nevertheless feel that the decision that is taken about acting is one that we can all live with sadly, without losing a sense that this was tragic, but nevertheless with a sense that what could be done was done, and we accept the result, tragedy and all.
The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.